complex array of tactics are employed by the Russian government to manipulate public sentiment in connection with Russia's war in Ukraine, and of course to stifle any internal dissent. Studying the politics of pacification can help us understand how authoritarian regimes maintain control over society through a mixture of incentives and fear. But as dissent increases, then repression needs to find new and more effective ways to maintain the authoritarian status quo and the semblance of normality. But there are also implications for state capture because these techniques can be learned, shared, and imposed on other societies. Their adaptations can be used as a toolkit for state capture and authoritarian control. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. This channel exists thanks to your encouragement and support, and it is very, very gratefully received. But to remain productive, to maintain the high quality and the daily cadence of video releases that counter the repetitive cycle of Russian propaganda, your support is absolutely essential. So thank you to everyone who's bought me a coffee or become a patron. And of course, thank you to all those who are supporting the documentary film project that we are looking to make in Ukraine in the early part of the new year. Today I'm speaking to Olga Vlasova, who is a visiting scholar at King's Russia Institute, where she conducts research on Russian politics and has a background in both practical politics and political science. Olga conducts research into the politics of fear and calming in Russia. Olga's dedication to democracy and public service is evident in her active involvement in Russian politics when, of course, that was more openly possible. She has been a candidate in parliamentary elections, an authorized representative in presidential elections, and has played a significant role in the campaigns of the centrist party in the Duma YABLOKO. Olga's research also focuses on propaganda and media, societal support for violence, digital authoritarianism, educational policies, and political education in contemporary European states. Olga, I'm delighted to welcome you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's my honor and pleasure to be with you today.
It's great because we are talking a lot about these sort of not just the politics of fear, but also this process, this mechanism of state capture, because we see in societies like Hungary, it's at a fairly complete level. We see those links to the Kremlin and certainly techniques being reproduced. We've got Georgia, which is in a transition state, full state capture, which hopefully won't succeed, but no one knows the outcome of that. And we've had an attempt in Romania and Moldova to roll out some of these techniques. But of course, they weren't pioneered in any of these countries. They were pioneered in Russia and particularly Belarus. Could you describe, how this resurgence of authoritarianism and development, or even one could say evolution of some of these techniques has taken place? When did it start? And what's the role, say, of Belarus in innovating and experimenting in some of these?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a really important question, and we really need to know and understand where it comes from and where it goes. And I'm trying to describe the politics which is implemented by the Kremlin towards the Russian society inside the country. And for me, it's really important to understand different layers of this Kremlin's politics, because it's very controversial on one hand, but on the other hand, we can see the real aim of this politics, and the aim is to induce the state of societal inaction. So I'm pretty sure that authoritarian regimes learn one from another, and of course Belarus is and Lukashenko is a kind of an example for Putin, but still Belarus never was in that kind of war that Russia is now. And that's why Russia is a unique example for us to study and to understand how the politics and this emotional governance can be maintained by the Kremlin. So to start with, I would like to draw the whole picture for you, how I see the politics of Kremlin towards the society. So we know that Russian society was previously depoliticized, and it's been depoliticized for more than 20 years already. And there is a huge amount of literature on Russian depoliticization processes. But it's interesting for us to study, let's call it still, depoliticization processes during the war, because it's kind of easy for the Kremlin, it was kind of easy for the Kremlin to take Russian society away from the politics and to tell it, stay out of the politics, just keep living your own life, do not care about any politics at all. It was quite easy before the war started, but the war itself is a political action, and the war itself is something that should make people think about politics, and should make people really have the feeling of right or wrong. And what we can see now is that even during the war, the Kremlin tries to induce this state of societal inaction. And here we go to different layers and different mechanisms of how the Kremlin really does it. So we know that there is a huge amount of this depoliticized people in Russia. But also we know that during the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, the big class of activists and regime opponents and dissent people appeared in Russia. So Kremlin faced to pacify and to take all these classes out of politics. And what we can see that towards those who are kind of engaged in their politics, there is a politics of fear implemented. But towards those who was previously depoliticized, it's the politics of pacification that is implemented by the Kremlin, and it's exactly the politics of pacification that is implemented towards the majority of the society. So how I really came to this, that was my personal kind of story, and rather unusual, because I was involved in Russian politics for quite some time. And after the war started, I decided to think about these Kremlin's mechanisms. And of course, it was only the politics of fear that came to my mind. And I was really thinking about politics of fear, that is something implemented towards all the society. And I really read a lot about this and about different examples of politics of fear in authoritarian states like Iraq and Iran. And I saw these examples that were implemented in Russia as well. And my last article is actually devoted to the politics of fear towards three main groups in Russia: opposition, elites, and regime supporters. So I can talk more about it, but even now you see that it's nearly the whole society, like all kind of classes: opposition and supporters, elites. All of these three classes, I argue, have a special politics of fear implemented towards them. And that's, of course, incredible. But then I started to talk to how they are called ordinary Russians. Like, how is their life looking, and how do they think about their life? Do they feel this fear that I was thinking was implemented towards their life? And the answers that I've got were quite surprisingly. I can even read you the answer from the interview that I've made. Like, well, if you don't think about the war, then you can continue living your ordinary life. Everything remains the same shops, the same cafes. Some corporations may have left, but we've already seen new ones emerge. We only have one life. What's the point of constantly dwelling on the war? And I really stuck here because there is no fear in it at all, even during the war. And even if we may see this prevalence of politics of pacification towards all the society. And then I understood that politics of fear in Russia is implemented towards those who are at least somehow involved in politics, at least think about it somehow. But the process of depoliticization, 20-year process of depoliticization, had its results. And so we know that the majority of society in Russia do not think about politics at all. And that would be the politics of pacification that's implemented towards them.
And I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because what you touch upon here is that fear alone is not going to keep a society passive in the way you've described. You need to have the carrot and the stick. You need to have incentives. You need to have status, privilege, resources to be able to give to people in exchange for either their passivity or their compliance or their loyalty, depending on who they are and which segment of society. And of course, it seems to me that those sort of incentives range in scale. Those who are more politically active might require larger resources, larger status, larger roles to pacify them. Whereas the person you've described there probably doesn't need an awful lot. They need their pension to be paid. They need their wages to be paid. They need to know they're not going to be, coerced into the SVO or conscripted or something like that. So we're talking essentially, I assume, here about the urban population more perhaps than the provincial population.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there is also this big difference between Moscow and other Russia. So again, we can see that Moscow is pacified more during the war. We can barely see any Z signs in Moscow supporting the war or anything. But there are lots of them in regions, for example. So it's very important for the government to have the sense of normal city of Moscow and to give Moscow citizens the sense that nothing is really going on there, or at least it doesn't touch them in any way. So yeah, the situation between Moscow and other cities is very interesting and important. But what is also important, we see that it's not only the pacification by incentives towards elites, for example, but it's a real politics of fear that is implemented towards them. Because, and what are the signs of this politics of fear? It's a narrative about enemies all over the world. It's a narrative about them being excluded if they leave the country, for example, or even assassinated. So that's really interesting how Putin and the Kremlin uses the narrative of sanctions to unify elites, and but on the other hand, to make them fear of the world, let's say, around Russia, and to make and to make them understand that it's only Russia where can they kind of feel safe. But on the other hand, this safety is really connected with the fear of the world around. And it is deepen very much nowadays towards elites. And on the other hand, they are I do not try to justify them, but still that's interesting situation, because they are in kind of a gap now, because with all the sanctions and this narrative about the West and the other world being Russia's enemy, so they can't leave the country. But if they, for example, oppose the war and the regime, so they won't be able to continue their work and have even ordinary salary inside the country. So they have to comply. Here, that's very interesting. Because towards elites, that's again the politics of fear is implemented, not the politics of pacification, because elites and all these state workers, they are kind of painted with blood, because there is this attempt to attract them to the war. There is no such an attempt to attract ordinary citizens, as I told you, in Moscow, for example, or any other businessman, just ordinary citizens. But elites, they really try to attract them in sponsoring the war, in making different things to the war, for the war, and to need something, to sow something, like anything, but you have to do anything by your hands for the war. And that's very, very interesting. So that makes me think that Putin tries to build these boundaries around elites, and inside these boundaries, it tries to politicize these elites, let's say.
And this is a mafia tactic in a way, isn't it? It's to make
Yeah.
people complicit in criminality. Therefore, you may oppose it in principle, you may oppose it morally, but you've become complicit in some way. You've got no way out. You're involved. And actually, that's not new. I suspect Putin has co-opted something which struck me very forcefully in the 90s. Because I was in St. Petersburg when he was, gaining authority, but we hadn't heard of him. We didn't know who he was. Everyone heard of Sobchak, but they didn't know the power behind the throne, as it were, in the mayoralty in St. Petersburg. But that technique essentially was, yes, you could reform the law so that various business activity becomes lawful. But
Mm.
actually, if you have conflicting laws, ambiguous laws, it means that every act in business is potentially unlawful or ambiguous. Then you have the choice of who to prosecute. It's a way of at that point, it's not authoritarian, but it's a way of picking and choosing your allies and starting to exert influence. So lack of firm foundations and rule of law being used in this manner, and now it's full coercion and complicity. It's an evolution, I think, of the 90s mafia culture.
Yeah. I would definitely agree with this. And it really has its root in 90s, so no surprise. Yeah, I definitely agree. And it's also a combination of this sentiment of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this dream of making Soviet Union and its traditions and like to make the nation great again, this kind of sentiments. So that is all combined here, and what is interesting that this Russia's isolation really kind of helps Putin to build these narratives now. And it's difficult really to go out of this cage finally. But another aspect that I'm really interested in is the politics of fear, for example, implemented towards the regime supporters. because even because I think that if you are a citizen of Russia, for example, of course you would, and you are kind of maybe interested in politics, but you don't want to feel this fear all the time. But during the war, there is nearly no escape from it for you, because what we see in Russian propaganda now, that it's those who support the war, they are really the target of fear, because this besieged state, it really gives you the feeling that you are a defender of the regime and of the state itself. And it means that you have to oppose both the opposition and the elites. And it also shows us the clashes that are deliberately made by the Kremlin, the clashes in the society, even especially among those who are politically active. You can be even regime supporter, but you will be divided from elites, for example, who are also kind of regime supporters. And that's really important to understand, because Putin knows that there shouldn't be any huge force, even if it's the political force that supports the regime. The example of this was Prigozhin, of course, and when he tried to criticize the governmental politics and all the stuff, so we could see that he became rather popular and like really fast. And what happened next was that he became dangerous to the regime. And that's why regime supporters are also seen as a threat by this regime. And that's why, again, it's a politics of fear that is implemented towards them. So to induce this state of inaction in the society, you have not to pacify, but to implement the politics of fear towards both elites and your supporters. And that's kind of really interesting, because it gives us an understanding of lots of suppressed emotions in these societal classes. And we don't really know where these suppressed emotions can bring us further.
Mm. And we'll come to this idea of assets and agents in a minute as well, because another part of this, of course, is that you've got a very large intelligence service, both internal and external. But we'll come to that one in a minute, because I just want to close out this idea of fear and the instrument of fear, because whereas, you're trying to create this sense of status quo, normality in places like Moscow, yeah, don't worry, there is a war, but it's not scary. It's not going to affect you. Of course, when drones come over Rublyovka, well, we'll come to that again in a minute, because that's kind of a fascinating dynamic as well. But I was speaking to Ilya Ponomarev,
Mhm.
who is a particular kind of antagonist to the Kremlin. He's perhaps one of the more dangerous, sort of diaspora ethnic Russians. But we were talking about the Donbass, because people will look at Russia and go, yeah, but it's not Stalinism, because it doesn't have this network of gulags. Yes, there's people locked up, but you look at the absolute numbers, it's horrific, but we're not talking about, hundreds of thousands of people. We're talking about thousands, if not tens of thousands of the upper limit, which is still terrible, but
Yeah.
it's not comparable. However, if you then flip that slightly and say, well, hang on a second, you've got this territory called Donbass. You've got a territory where genocide is taking place. You've got a territory where brainwashing on an extraordinary scale is taking place. Genocide of the male population by being pushed into the army. You've also got that as a tool, whereas if anyone shows internal dissent in Russia, it's no longer the gulag in Siberia, but it's the gulag in plain sight, the outsourced gulag as part of the SVO. You can always threaten people. Okay, if you don't like it, right, you're going to the front. And that seems to me that we've missed one of the most obvious aspects of Putin's regime and his terror tactics. He has recreated the gulag, but not in a way we immediately recognize from history.
Yes, and there was also this um, narrative that so I do not actually remember, but one of the members of parliament suggested that we should send uh, uh, opposition leaders or someone who opposed the regime to the war. And then there was kind of a discussion around this because, and now we do not hear such suggestions anymore because they say that the war is mostly a privilege. Yeah, so you can't just send someone as to the jail there. But and you know that's really interesting because even with conscription, even with sending people to the war, and even with partial mobilization, they tried to pacify the population. So what is interesting is that these procedures and processes, they could really affect different kind of people in Russia, and also those who are kind of ordinary and who are not elites and who are completely depoliticized. And that was rather worrying for the Kremlin because we could see during the partial mobilization that the level of anxiety in Russia was incredible. Like it was really, really high. And that meant that something went wrong. And when I tried to analyze how propaganda depicted all these situations, I could see that it was definitely the politics of pacification that tried to show that mobilization is only partial. It won't touch you or your family anyway, because it's only for those who are somehow is taught for the military or yeah, some kind of these kind of things. But then we could also see that lots of people, for example, that were conscripted, and when there were some mistakes making because of these conscriptions, and there were lots of propaganda articles about amendments of these mistakes. So even for those who tried to see some errors or that something was going wrong during the mobilization, there were lots of propaganda articles advising that everything is going according to a plan, and that we do not really need to amend anything, that everything is done absolutely perfectly.
I
So
remember that. There was Solovyov did one, didn't he? Threatening to send all the conscription officers to the front themselves if they don't
yeah,
fix the problems, you know. I mean, he
yeah.
doesn't really care, of course, and he's not actually agitating, but it's to create the impression that the regime still has a connection to the people. It's maintaining that sort of, you've got the Tsar and the boyars, and it's the officials that are messed up. The Tsar is untouchable. It's perpetuating that.
Yes, and also there were lots of news about conscripting of MPs, for example, of different levels. Like you don't need to be worried about mobilization because we have so many volunteers who are willing to conscript themselves. So that was also very interesting, and all these kind of narratives that it won't touch you anyway. And also bloggers played an important role there because there were lots of pictures with different pretty ladies like showing one fry from French fry from the pack, like that it's only 1% who will be mobilized and you don't have to care. No panic. There was a special campaign, no panic. So you see, it differs from Stalin's Gulag, let's say. So on one hand, practically, we can see the evidences of this, but uh, on the other hand, in terms of propaganda, it differs a lot. And that's why people inside Russia do not perceive it this way.
And Putin has always been very selective, I would say, quite surgical in the use of terror. Of course, Stalin was industrial on the scale there, and there was quite a lot of capriciousness and randomness in the terror as well. But Putin is very, very surgical, and he won't even touch people who are necessarily opposition, but if they don't represent a threat to the monetary interests, the business model of the regime, then, he seems not to waste too much resources on them. But if they start to threaten how the regime gets its sources of finance, again, we're coming back to the Mafia thing, it's the
Mhm.
combination of KGB and Mafia. About who they go after, which is, one of the reasons potentially why they went after Litvinenko. Yes, he was a traitor to the KGB in their eyes. Yes, he criticized the regime. But more particularly than that, the work he did threatened income sources to members of the elite and Putin directly. But it does seem that the idea of the SVR, whatever the propaganda says, subliminally, it's still an effective fear technique because we see the sort of partial mobilization equals surgical terror. I hear stories of people who visited queued up at Navalny's funeral, and they weren't touched on the day or the preceding days, but they were captured by face recognition CCTV, which of course now is ubiquitous in central Moscow. And then they found at their places of work or home addresses where their sort of propiskas and whatever were, they get call-up papers. So an extremely kind of surgical process. Now we see people being rounded up in sort of gay nightclubs and they're arrested, and the next day or even on the spot they're handed their mobilization papers. So it does seem that there is, even if they don't want to turn that into a propagandistic narrative, it has this kind of background element of fear. And of course, we know that in Ukraine, it seems that that historic memory triggers a very different response, which is resistance to authority. Whereas in the Russian mindset, the historic memory of the Gulag, the historic memory of the fear, can be triggered to create what you've called, the politics of stability and pacification, because that fear is rooted in deep, personal and societal memory.
Yeah, it is. That's a very good point, actually. And um, what I see now is that there is an evolution actually of what is going on with perceiving of all the war inside the Russia. So when the war started, we could see a real shock in all the society. Like nobody could really believe that it was possible. I know that even some generals and some military men, they couldn't believe that the war really could start. So that was a shock for the whole society. And that's why that was difficult for the government to organize, let's say, this rally around the flag effect. When all this society kind of uh, support the war and the decision of the government to begin the war. And I don't think that we ever had this effect in Russia with this war. Because if we would have then if we had it, then it would end in 12 or maximum 24 months, but it didn't. So I don't think that we had this rally around the flag effect. We had a shock, I argue, and then in a month after the war started, the process of justification started. So people tried to understand what was all this about. Like there is no smoke without a fire, so something perhaps there should be some reasons, and all these kind of things. But still, that was not rally around the flag. And at that period of time, the politics of pacification was one of the most productive elements implemented by the Kremlin. Because to pacify and to calm the population that was in such a great level of anxiety and shock was really important for stability in Russia. But in a year and a half, and in 2 years after the war started, the situation changed a little bit. And what we see now is the kind of normalization of the war itself for the majority of the society. And even the Kremlin, that's why, started to use the word war because previously it didn't use it. And now it's okay for the Kremlin to use it because it appeared to be normal, finally. And now the politics of fear is something that is trying to be introduced mostly. So if during the first year it was the politics of pacification, now they try to introduce the politics of fear more. And of course, the main target is opposition. So we talked about elites already and regime supporters, but opposition is the main target. And that's not only about repressions, of course. That's again about othering, to show that those who oppose the regime, they differ, so they are marginalized and they are excluded from the society by different means, by the introducing of the law of about foreign agents, for example, undesirable organizations. So these people have to be marked by themselves that I'm a foreign agent. If you're recognized and you want to write anything, you have to mark yourself this way. And of course, all this again works on dividing the society even more than it was previously and when it was before the war. So again, talking about Lukashenko and Belarus, Putin learned a lot from him, because to show the general public that everything is all right and nothing really changed, he decided not to close borders, for example, not to introduce martial law, but to give the population all the possibilities to live their ordinary life. And on the other hand, he tries to not only repress opposition, but tries to make his opponents leave the country, like completely leave the country. And that's really interesting, because he understands that when a politician leaves the country, it's difficult for him to work inside, because there is this narrative of othering and marginalization of those who left. So if you left, you are not, I don't know, Russian anymore or whatever. And that's why people inside, even with the same kind of views, they they subconsciously do not listen to those people. So that's really difficult to work from outside the country with people inside.
So all the sort of, pretty strong correspondence that we see and activists, people like Michael Naki and so on, they actually get huge audiences. But actually, I've always suspected that a big chunk of that is probably diaspora,
Yeah.
rather than people necessarily on VPNs in Siberia or wherever. there are some interesting mechanics. I mean, we could probably talk for many, many hours on this topic. But I'm absolutely fascinated by this table. And if it's possible, we're going to put a link to your article in the description of this video, because I think it's a fantastic article. There's incredible detail, but there's this brilliant table that summarizes the politics of fear as to whether you're opposition, elite, or regime supporters. And I'm really interested in this middle one, which is the self-censorship.
Yeah.
Yes, emigration, but for those who remain, there's a process of self-censorship that goes on. There's almost like a compliance with authority, even when authority hasn't given the explicit order. You're sort of obeying in advance, to use the phrase of Professor Timothy Schneider. And I think, some of his studies and books actually talk some of these points very effectively. And we see some of that taking place in Trumpian America as well, with various, especially media outlets, business owners who are obeying in advance, showing loyalty, even when that hasn't been explicitly demanded. That's a fascinating process. But then, if we take that to the next level, you have this extraordinary propaganda. And some of it is, we know a lot of it is hate-filled, genocidal in content. Some of it is just off the scale, crazy kind of stuff. It's also imbued with conspiracy theories, and sometimes stuff which is absolutely absurd, but it serves the purpose that if you're in opposition, you just avoid talking about it completely. You stay away from that subject. If you're part of the elite or regime supporters, you have to repeat this nonsense, not because you believe it, but because it communicates loyalty to the system. So how important is it as part of this politics of fear that if you are going to stay in the country, that you demonstrate loyalty through your actions and especially your words?
Yes, and this self-censorship, it refers to uh, all kinds of politicized society. Like if you are in a position that's the most intriguing case, then the process of I called it the normalization of fear is taking place there, because finally you decide that it's possible to live in the country when you have such a huge rate of uncertainty, when you do not know if you will be arrested or not, and that's kind of possible to survive in this kind of environment. And it really gives us this normalization of fear. People get used to live in this kind of environment. Uh, at uh, uh, at the same time, it of course leads us to this what you called self-censorship and avoidance, because people, if they do not emigrate, and not everyone can really afford this immigration process, but you have to stay and you have to survive somehow. And in this case, you either do not speak at all, or I call it internal immigration, or you try to speak correctly in some terms that would allow you to stay alive and not arrested. And that's really important and interesting to observe, because all this language of opposition inside Russia, it's also kind of specifying language finally, because the narratives that we can hear from opposition leaders inside Russia are mainly connected with the Third World War, for example, with narratives about the global warfare, nuclear war possibilities, and they are mainly connected with the aspect that the war is everywhere in the world, and that there is no escape from its reach at all. And that to some extent really pacifies the politicized and dissent part of the population, because if it's so global, then nowhere is, let's say, better than in Russia. So what's the case of doing anything at all? If it's so global, you can't really oppose it. It justify these narratives. They justify the war in Ukraine. They show that Russia is not unique in this sense, and so that's a very, very interesting process. But of course, we hear these narratives are also from opposition leaders uh, as appeals to stop the war in Ukraine in order to prevent the nuclear or the Third World War. So that's interesting. And yeah, that's why we see that there is this evolution, of course, in perception of the war and in behavioral aspects of opposition itself. So even opposition and its narratives differ a lot in the beginning of the war and now. It all develops a lot. And if we talk, for example, about self-censorship in elites, so it's quite obvious. People just can't talk at all there. I mean, they will be fired, or there are so many threats that they face, even not if you're a high-ranked person, but if you work for the state, you have to comply with all these narratives. It's really difficult and dangerous for those who work for the state to have their, let's say, opposition opinions. So, yeah, that's very, very difficult. And that's also important to understand that those people are not free at all. They are really controlled. They can't go to, let's say, enemy countries like the UK. They can really face different kinds of problems inside Russia if they go there. And that, of course, really restricts their life in general. But if we are talking about regime supporters, so that's also interesting because, of course, they also have to follow this self-censorship tactics. We have different arrests of regime supporters in Russia as well. For example, Strelkov, and we had an assassination of Prigozhin. So we see that it's not allowed at all to say whatever you want. So of course, again, kind of you have to always think about what is allowed to say and what is not, even if you are a regime and war supporter. So yeah, that's very, very interesting. So you always have to comply with the main line, whatever kind of mind you have.
And I was going to say to that as well, and this is interesting because I've wondered all the way through, Vladimir Tatarsky, what was going on there, what happened there. But I think in the light of what you said, it's fairly obvious because he seemed to begin to believe that he could write his own script, that he'd become such a personality, such a force that he could adapt and innovate and deviate from those narratives that are handed down. He's gone off script. And we don't have any evidence for who took him out. But I think that very act of going off script puts you in an extremely dangerous position if you're a more dangerous position, perhaps, if you're a loyalist than if you're an oppositionist, in fact.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because if you are a loyalist and a regime supporter, so then you can kind of use all these narratives that are used by regime itself to make your popularity higher. And that's not allowed at all, because there are several narratives that are used by the Kremlin itself, but of course you can't use them. For example, the narrative of I don't know, migration in Russia, or illegal migration. So that's a very, very strong narrative that is used by the Kremlin. But no one can really make his own popularity and to gain votes finally on this topic. So that's really important for us to understand that there is nearly no public politics in Russia during the war. So there are still these elections and voting procedures in Russia, like mayoral elections, for example, Moscow City Duma elections, right? And there will be even State Duma elections. But we can't really see any campaigns and any campaigning during the wartime. So we know that there are these procedures that are taking place in Russia, but there are no campaigns, because the Kremlin now is really afraid of any narratives that can contradict to the main line. So if you run for the seat in the parliament or wherever, you have just to show your face, but you can't say anything. That is what is going on any kind of elections now. If you have your own narrative, your own story, and you're a real politician, for example, you won't be even allowed to go for these elections. And that's why there are no campaigns at all. And we could really see, and especially in Moscow again, because Moscow is something that should be absolutely calm, and that's why we observed that there were even no billboards during the mayoral campaign, like no billboards on streets at all, even for Sobyanin, for example, like no at all, and of course of no other candidates. And the same procedure took place during the Moscow City election, Moscow City Duma election, because there were different candidates on different electoral parts of the city, but nowhere there was a political campaign. And there were some opposition candidates during these elections, but they were not allowed to run for these elections. They were not allowed to because of the signature process, although they could collect all the signatures needed, but they were not allowed to run for the election. And I think that it was made deliberately to avoid any political discussion, avoid any discussion of political positions at all.
And the very last question, there are a million others I've got, but the very last one I think is the one that is least understood in the West, because we have this persistent argument: well, why don't people protest? Why don't they do this, that? And there's passivity certainly, and there's deep sort of cultural reasons, historical reasons why that doesn't happen. There's the disenchantment with politics, and that's something that has been fostered by the regime over many decades, in fact. But I think the bit that's really not understood is how far all privilege, status, and resources flow from the state. Even if it's private corporations, ultimately it's not like a Western society where the government cannot say, oh, hang on a second, you've got employees who've done something we don't like. It cannot work through private bodies, institutions, and companies to coerce individuals in society. But of course, the Russian state can and does. And in fact, ultimately, all resources flow from the largesse of the government. And that is an extraordinarily powerful tool of coercion, and it covers the whole spectrum. Everything we've talked about, ultimately, the government can withdraw resource from you. It can take your property away. It can take away your privilege. It can take away everything you use to define your life and to create any kind of material comfort. And I think we fail to appreciate just the deeply pernicious and even fear-inducing idea that you don't actually have any agency over your life, whether you're rich or poor, whether you're even an oligarch or not. Ultimately, this doesn't belong to you. It's on loan and it's in return for your fealty and your loyalty.
Yeah, thank you for this question. And actually, that was something that I tried not to justify, but to think about when I started my research on politics of fear and pacification. That was really interesting for me to understand why people do not protest in the way we might want them to, and why the things were as they were. So, and you know, um, that was a many year process. Like we really see that this deliberate depoliticization of Russian population took place for more than 20 years already. People were told to keep away from politics for more than 20 years. And here we see the roots of 90s, because during the 90s, people kind of tried to be engaged in politics and tried to participate. But the result of it was that they became completely poor and they felt foolish. And that's something that is completely intertwined in their on their subconsciousness level, because they now think that if there is too much politics, like in 90s, then there is this empty fridge. And that's a real trauma of the whole society still. So the narratives like keep away from politics and your life will be all right, and you will have this full fridge, and your salaries will go up, and your pensions will go up. It really worked, especially during these Putin years with high oil prices. It really worked, and kind of people believed in this, that if they think only about themselves, not about neighbors, not about society, not about politics, but only about themselves. And if they buy their own flat, their own car, and their own dacha, that would be kind of enough. And another thing is that the higher is your fence on the dacha, the better. So all these narratives led us to complete atomization of the society on one hand, and on the other hand, it led us to the understanding that people were completely depoliticized. So as I told you, it was only during the last 10, 15 years that young generation mainly again decided to get engaged into politics. And of course, Navalny was one of the leaders of this process, and he made it very attractive again, kind of, to be part of the political process and of opposition movement. But we know that the Kremlin tried to employ all these politics of fear mechanisms to suppress all these new opposition movements. And nowadays, it's impossible to be the follower of Navalny or to go out on the street and protest, because you will be arrested like immediately, and you never know for how many years. So it's really, really dangerous now. I do remember, for example, in 2006, 8, 10, we could go out on the streets and protest, and the fine was £10 if you go out on the street and protest, and the police couldn't couldn't arrest you for more than 3 hours. That was really nice, and we really kind of used that time because you could really go, spend 3 hours in the police, pay £10 as a fine, and that's it. But after 2011, the fines grew up extremely, and an ordinary person couldn't afford anymore to pay this fines. So in this times, the situation changed a lot, but still the civil society tried to collect this money to help people to pay fines. So still there were this kind of protests, but after that the new laws and huge amount of years for and so in at this time people were arrested for lots of years, and that was a new reality for all the opposition. So we couldn't really go on the streets and risk like real lives. That was not a question of fines anymore, but that is a question of one's life. So yeah, that's really another situation nowadays in Russia.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. We'll have to end it there because, as I say, there's so many things to talk about here and unpack further. I think as you produce new articles, it'd be fantastic to dive into those and examine it. I'm very
Thank you.
interested in this point you make about people with their little plot of land, their dacha, their high walls, no sense of society, because I went to Ukraine for the first time in August, and I was kind of expected to see that same kind of stuff, which had been familiar to me. I mean, those high walls, creating your own patch of little sort of, personal civilization. And then you go out on the street, and the street is completely uncared for. I mean, this is the total absence of society, as it were. And I found it very interesting in Ukraine that in the villages I passed through, the complete opposite. Houses did not have high walls. They had open doors and gates. They would have, fruit on the trees. This was summer, and it's perfectly safe. You don't have to be in the house. No one's going to come in and steal your fruit. You have garden furniture out in the garden, and no one touches it. But also, what was absolutely fascinating to me, there was a sense of public space in that people were caring for the pavement and the road and the ditch and the verge that wasn't part of their property but formed part of that communal space in front. Now, this might sound trivial to people, but I think democracy emerges from these fundamental values of people trusting their neighbors, of people taking responsibility not just for their own property and taking some responsibility for the public sphere and the public space. And indeed, you know, not having a massive walled house here and then a hovel next to it, having that gap or that difference between people is smoothed out in some way, which will help. But I'm sure we can talk endlessly about that. But that's I think an interesting point to go into those details. I strongly recommend people read the article. There is so much more in there than we've discussed, but hopefully this will be a teaser for people to explore this topic more. And I think it's absolutely pertinent because the mechanisms of the politics of fear and state capture have been exported, are easily exported to degrade democratic institution, rule of law based societies. And I think we need to have awareness of the mechanics of this to warn us against those processes. But for today, Olga, thank you so much for coming on the channel.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was my pleasure. Thank you.